Warning! If you haven't seen anything past Season 3 of Game of Thrones or haven't read anything past A Clash of Kings in the books, then I advise you to please turn away now before you get a nasty dose of spoilers. Is everybody gone? Yeah? Alright. Let's get to it then. So in Game of Thrones Season 3, Episode 9, we are treated to what is possibly the most shocking event in television history. 3 years later, this episode is rated a wild 9.9 on IMDb out of over 43,000 ratings. The thing everybody remembers, of course, is the shocking and horrific deaths of Robb Stark, his wife Talisa, his mother Catelyn, and the destruction of their entire army. But the most shocking part of this to the viewers is that it happened at a wedding where they all assumed that they would be safe. What we instantly remember about our favorite fiction, however, we have forgotten about our own history. The events that actually inspired George R.R. Martin to write The Red Wedding happened in real history twice, and they were both in Scotland. The first of these inspirational events happened in the year 1440 in Edinburgh. The Black Douglas clan was growing very powerful and influential in the medieval kingdom of Scotland. In 1437, the King of Scotland, James I, was murdered and his 6-year-old son, unoriginally named James II, became the king next. Archibald Douglas became the regent of the kingdom should anything have happened to the young boy king, but his appointment to such a high office left other high lords feeling very jealous, specifically Lord William Crichton and Alexander Livingston. 2 years later, after becoming the regent, Archibald Douglas died and left behind his 2 young sons. Sensing the opportunity, Crichton kind of started treating the young James II like Littlefinger treats Robin Arryn in a Game of Thrones. He manipulates the boy and manages to secure the position of Lord Chancellor, and then further convinces the young king to invite the 2 Douglas children to a dinner with them. So shortly afterwards, the 2 Douglas boys arrive at the castle in Edinburgh and begin to dine with the young King James and Lord Crichton. Now before we go any further, I'm curious if any of you watching this have thought up to this point exactly how old these boys were. Because the truth makes what I'm about to tell you incredibly disturbing. We know that King James was young, but at this point he was 10 years old. William Douglas, the eldest brother, was 16 and his younger brother David was only 11. For lack of a better phrase, history is fucked up a lot of the time. So, these children and a few lords are all just having the time of their lives eating together when suddenly and ominously, a man comes to the table with the head of a black bull on a plate. The head of the bull is placed down in front of the 2 Douglas boys as a sign of their imminent deaths, and they are both quickly grabbed and dragged outside into the courtyard where they're given mock trials. Sentenced to die very quickly, the older brother William pleaded that his younger brother should be beheaded first so that he wouldn't have to witness his death. They agreed, and both boys were promptly beheaded one after the other. Similar to the Red Wedding, this was an instance of guests being murdered in their host's home. Considered a horrible crime in both fiction and non-fiction, the next event is probably even more grim, but it was the opposite event, where it was the guests that did the murdering on their hosts. This next event takes place a few hundred years and a few Jameses later, but still remains in Scotland. Starting in 1688, we fast forward from James II all the way up to James VII, but confusingly he was also the King of England and Ireland and was known as James II in those kingdoms because they had only had one James before. Anyway, that year this dude from the Netherlands named William landed in England and overthrew James in a glorious revolution. James fled the country to France and England quickly named William as their new king. Scotland, however, was a tad more cautious than that and demanded a resume from both James and William for why they should each be king. After reading through James's resume and feeling disappointed, the Scots decided to take William as their king too. However, much of the Highland Scots weren't exactly fans of that decision and rose up in revolt in support of James. This rebellion added more fuel to the ancient rivalry between 2 old Scottish clans, the MacDonalds and the Campbells. Members of the MacDonald clan had allegedly raided and looted the farm of a member of the Campbell clan during the rebellion, Robert Campbell, and killed some of his livestock. After suffering disastrous military defeats, the Highlanders surrendered and yielded. In August, William offered all the clans a pardon for their part in the rebellion so long as they renounced their oaths to James and took a new oath of loyalty to William himself before the end of the year. As in Game of Thrones, oaths were taken extremely importantly by the Highlanders. Conflicted with the dilemma of honor, the MacDonald clan and others sent letters to James requesting permission to end their oaths to him and to make new ones to William. James hesitated for a while because he thought he may still have a chance, but eventually decided it was hopeless and finally sent letters back saying okay. This is 1691 though in Europe, so internet and instant messaging wasn't exactly a thing, so the letters took a long time to arrive. The MacDonald clan didn't receive their letter until the middle of December though, and true to procrastination I'm sure many of you are doing now watching this video, Alistair MacLean waited until literally the very last day before the deadline on December 31st to go out and deliver his oath. Alistair MacLean was the head of the MacDonald clan, and if you're worried about turning in something late, it's okay, because at least your life probably isn't on the line like this guy's was. So on that day he met with his governor named Colonel Hill, who told him that he wasn't qualified to hear his oath. Hill told him to instead travel to another city where a man named Sir Colin Campbell could hear his oath. Some of you probably know what the feeling "oh shit" feels like, and that has to be how Alistair MacLean felt. He left and tried to get there as quickly as he could, but he was held up by a bad snowstorm, and then this tool named Captain Drummond showed up, who detained him in a castle with his soldiers for a whole day just to delay him. After being let go from him, Alistair finally made it to the town, but he was 3 days late past his deadline. And then he had to wait another 3 days for Colin Campbell to make it back from his holiday. Finally, 6 days past the deadline, Colin reluctantly accepted the oath from Alistair. Things only got worse for him, though, when news of his late oath arrived in London. John Campbell and Archibald Campbell had a conversation with the Scottish Secretary of State named John Dalrymple. This guy disliked the Highlander Scots to begin with and thought the clan system was backward, so he wasn't hard to convince. Dalrymple managed to convince King William to sign an order to wipe out the MacDonald family in their hometown of Glencoe. Later in the winter of 1692, Robert Campbell, the guy whose farm was raided a few years ago, not suspiciously at all, shows up at the MacDonald family home with 120 other men. Robert says it's freezing out here, because it's winter, in Scotland, and there's nowhere else to stay. Alistair, being a nice guy, thinks sure, okay, and lets them all in. Guest rights are a huge deal in Game of Thrones. When Robb and co show up at the Freys, they are given guest rights and thus tricked into a false sense of security. The same happens here, but in reverse. These guests stay with the MacDonalds for 2 weeks before that tool Captain Drummond shows up again. Alistair probably would have thought, oh man, all of my enemies and hundreds of men are just showing up in my home. I think something is about to go down. Except Drummond remained hidden away from the others and brought the final orders from above to kill them all. That night, Robert Campbell and the others stayed up playing cards with their hosts and wished them all a good night. They stayed up until everybody was asleep, and then the slaughter began. The Campbell men went into the rooms and began slaughtering people in their beds. Alistair himself was cut down by swords as he tried rising from his bed. 38 MacDonald men in total were murdered in their homes by their own guests, and another 40 women and children escaped into the wilderness but quickly froze to death in the harsh winter weather. The Campbells burned the MacDonald houses to the ground, and the scene very likely resembled the immediate aftermath of the Red Wedding at the Twins, where the Freys and Boltons burn the Stark tents and massacre their men. If Game of Thrones truly goes the way of history, it's likely that justice will never be served, or at least be bittersweet. Murder under trust was considered the most heinous crime in Scotland, just like it is in Westeros. We hear Bran at one point say,
"He killed a guest beneath his roof. That's something the gods can't forgive."
But killing a host under their roof is considered just as bad. However, since the king himself had signed the order, it was all kind of just hushed up and the blame was shifted elsewhere. John Campbell was imprisoned for a few days, but that was all. Perhaps the worst and most hilarious consequence for the Campbell clan is that a hotel and pub in Glencoe called the Clocaig Inn to this day has a sign above their door that says, "No Campbells." So thank you for watching. If you'd like to watch more Game of Thrones related history videos, there's 2 more linked below and there will definitely be more to come. Don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to stay tuned in, and check me out on Facebook and Twitter. Cheers, everyone.